Welcome to the Betterment Lectures. My name is Dr. Dorian Miners, and if there is one thing I've learned as a brain scientist, it is that there is no instruction manual for this device in our head. But there are patterns of thought, of feeling, of action, because that's the brain's job, creating the patterns that gracefully handle the predictable shapes of everyday life. Now, we call these things ideologies or rituals or biases, but there's something else that I've learned teaching this stuff. And that's that we are animals first. You can't escape these patterns, but what you can do is choose which ones to emphasize. So let me teach you about them. One pattern, one podcast, and you choose if it works for you. That's the idea, so let's get into it. Now, I've done a longer intro than I plan to do so in the future because, as I said in the last podcast, I'm recording the first few and I want to set a sort of baseline for people coming for the first time. I'm also thinking about how to hook people in with the first series. And the first podcast went down pretty well. So this one pattern, one podcast thing is definitely staying. I also did manage to deliver the podcast after a day of teaching before going home. So the time frame also seems like it's going to work, although it took more like 4 hours than 2 or 3. So let's see if we can get it lower this time. Make sure that this length of podcast is going to be feasible for me. But some feedback on the first podcast with regard to trying to hook you in is that maybe the lectures shouldn't all be brain science. As a brain scientist, that's what I love, obviously. But teaching here as associate professor at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, we cover way more stuff. And in my career as an academic and a clinician, I've also covered more stuff. So I'm going to try and demonstrate a bit more of a range and see if I can make it a bit more exciting. Let's see, I'll be interested to hear what you think. Now, this one is more topical than anything else. I'm wondering if you've seen that Vogue article entitled, "Is Having a Boyfriend Embarrassing Now?" I'll drop a link in the show notes, but they covered a few reasons why it's starting to be less trendy to show your partner on social media and that sort of thing. And I want to zoom in on one particular reason. I'll quote them. "Boyfriends are out of style. They won't come back until they start acting right," read another respondent to their survey with 10,000 likes. Now, I have my own perspective on this, and while I say the words perspective, I should make very clear that this is not the perspective of my workplace of Sandhurst. This is just little old Dorian doing his podcast, but I have this idea for an article I want to write that I think will cover this in more detail, but the Vogue article talks to it, which is, I think there's something very interesting about how we talk about what men and what women are supposed to be and supposed to do and how they're supposed to act, I guess. And I think that in particular, that these framings that we put together have this interesting side effect that can hide incompetence. In men, certainly, probably in women too, but I'm more familiar with men, obviously. And in an increasingly feminized world, I think that this is confusing men and women. The former who want to do more but don't know how, and the women who are now expecting more because the world is more accessible to them and they're finding, as Vogue said, boyfriends embarrassing. And to illustrate this, I want to use this book from the 90s that is also coming back into vogue, excuse the pun. My most popular article is on the book Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. Now, this article is a bit more irreverent than some of the others on my website, but it comes directly out of observations I had while working in more clinical environments. And it seems like it might make a pretty fun podcast. So let's see. All right, we're going to start with some background. The article and the request to review the book, in fact, come at a time where there's this huge spike in gender essentialism, exploring what it means to be a true man or a true woman. And the reasons for that are probably a little bigger than this little lecture, but you do see a lot of it in the popularity of Joe Rogan or the spike in content about what being a man is supposed to be by people like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Huberman or, even Andrew Tate. And obviously as a man, this isn't that surprising to me. Lots of people around me complain about the feminization of the world and how it has made being a man seem more difficult. And I think Sebastian Junger put this really nicely in his book Tribe. So Junger is the journo who did the doco Restrepo about a unit deployed on operations and the feelings of brotherhood and camaraderie and the struggle they had reassimilating to the world. And he wrote this book, Tribe, as a result of that. And he mentions in this book that it's one of the reasons young men join the military still. A lot of kids trying to find manhood in one of its last traditional bastions in a world where, maybe a lot of aspects of manhood appear more toxic. So that's not surprising for me. I mean, that book is maybe like 10 years old now. But what's more surprising is a similar spike in content around modern takes on traditional female roles. Like there's a fantastic show, Mormon Wives, or where it came from, Mom Talk, which is a TikTok thing around this kind of trad wife aesthetic. Or, any of the trad wife and stay-at-home mum communities online. And I don't know if this is new or if I've only just started noticing it, but it does seem to be everywhere these days. And the sad fact is that although there are trivially obvious differences in anatomy between males and females, there is a huge amount of disagreement about how that plays out in behaviour. I mean, sexual dimorphism is something that is well studied and it's a pretty confused literature. There's not a lot of clear findings, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish this from the influence of social norms, right? The environment. So it's like very cheap and easy to make up an evolutionary story about how men should be this way and women should be that way. But it's not very easy to go back 7 million years ago when we diverged from chimpanzees and run this experiment again, So it's just a very hard debate to resolve, this nature versus nurture thing. And so there's this growing appetite for gender essentialism, but there's very little to ground it properly. And so there's this resultant sort of glut of content that tells aspiring men and women what it is that they're supposed to be. And where better to turn than this book from the 90s, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, by John Gray, PhD. And I'll tell you something, I was a big fan of this book when I was 21, 22, something like this. My mum told me to read it because it influenced her, and it certainly influenced me. It talks about how men and women have different needs and communication styles and how those can come into conflict. Seems transparently true. So when people asked me to review the book, I was keen to get back into it. And in doing that, I realized that if you are the kind of person who wants to re-examine what it means to be a man or a woman, you're excited by this new trend in gender essentialism, it speaks to you, then my advice is to pick any book but this book, because this one is an embarrassment. It's like 300 pages of some randos blinding insecurities. But what it is a good example of is the way that we frame how men and women should be and how that can obscure real incompetence. How really men and women aren't so different, but the way we talk about them makes it seem like they are and gives us these little pockets to hide in. So let's talk about Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, because it really shows how John Gray's men are embarrassing. Let's check it out. We should probably talk about John Gray himself to start with. And what's notable is that his Wikipedia page has him coming off like a charlatan. And if Wikipedia, a site that anybody, including John Gray and his team, can edit, lists a bunch of shady stuff about a person, you should probably be pretty skeptical off the bat. Now, I'm not that keen for a defamation lawsuit, so what I'll do is I'll put some links in so you can do your own research. But since I think that the PhD part is a particular draw card to this book, I'll point out he has a history of flirting with unaccredited institutions. So as far as I can tell, his bachelor and master's degrees aren't clearly from accredited institutions. There is some confusion about whether his degree in, I'll quote Wikipedia here, the science of creative intelligence is from the non-accredited Maharishi European Research University in Switzerland or the accredited Maharishi International University in Fairfield, Iowa. Now that wouldn't be a great start, but obviously I'd be happy to put that aside. It's not always about where you came from, it's about where you go. And in this case, Gray went to an unaccredited PhD in 1982. And he did this with a now defunct correspondence institution that was lazily fraudulent. I mean, again, off Wikipedia for the institution, the council's review of their numerous violations of academic standards included a master's degree student given credit for a learning contract describing how he would continue taking dance lessons and watch dance demonstrations, or a PhD dissertation written in Spanish approved by 4 faculty who couldn't speak the language, or a dissertation that had no hypothesis, no data collection, and no statistical analysis, which a visiting committee member characterised as more like a project paper at the college freshman level. So, not a super auspicious start. And I think he claims an honorary doctorate now, but I should point out that an honorary doctorate requires no study. It's just something that a university gives you. So, we're a little bit concerned about that. We're also concerned about an FDA cease and desist order for violating their laws around marketing supplements as drugs on his marsvenus.com website, and a book where one of the claims is about how warm baths could improve autism symptoms. So this guy's not like a traditional academic, I guess we could say. But like I said, I don't want to get too much into the person. We don't want to do an ad hominem attack. We should look at the content because the framing is the really interesting thing. And I'll start with Chapter 2, the Mr. Fix-It and Home Improvement Committee. He describes Chapter 2 like this. We're going to explore how men and women's values are inherently different and try and understand the 2 biggest mistakes we make in relating to the opposite sex. Men mistakenly offer solutions and invalidate feelings while women offer unsolicited advice and direction. So far, not controversial. If we are gender essentialists, maybe we suspect that men and women do have inherently different values for whatever reason, biological or social, whatever. And it's not a leap to assume that this would lead to some miscommunication. And really, this is the chapter I remember from reading this so long ago. It's the reason I saw it in a positive light. I think we could take this at face value for the moment. It feels kind of truthy. John says that this is because men, and I quote, value power, competency, efficiency, and achievement. They're doing things to prove themselves, develop their power and skills. He goes on to say some weird stuff about how that means they don't read magazines like Psychology Today, but like to hunt and fish. But I think this sort of idea that men care about objects and things rather than people and feelings, it's not just something that John has made up. There really feels something truthy about this. And I know teaching undergrad psychology at Cambridge, we would teach a study that talked about how infant boys and girls would prefer different toys at a very young age that were related, according to the paper, more relationally or more mechanically, I suppose. So I think he's reflecting something in the the zeitgeist, something that's in the air. But John makes the mistake of going on. John says, and I quote, men, unlike women, rarely talk about problems unless he needs advice. Why involve someone else when I can do it myself? He keeps his problems to himself unless he requires help, because asking somebody else for help is a sign of weakness. So the upshot for John is that when women are talking about some kind of problem, men will offer solutions. That's the only reason men talk, right? And when women reject the solutions but remain upset, it becomes hard for the men to listen because his solution is being rejected and he feels increasingly useless. Now, again, I'm reading this with my back up, but I do remember reading this and feeling like it was totally believable. John was singing to my heart. If all these idiots, if my partner at the time would just listen to my advice, then their problems would vanish. Why are they complaining if they're not going to do anything about it? But of course, this is absurd. I would tell myself back then, look, sometimes, Dorian, people want to complain about shit and sometimes they might want your help. And in fact, sometimes you just want to complain about shit and sometimes you want help. And usually when people want your help, they'll ask you for it, right? If they're not asking you for it, they probably don't want your help. And none of that, Dorian, is contingent upon your gender, right? But Gray is hiding it here. and I don't think intentionally. I think we all do this. He hides it in this kind of intuitive idea about how men care more about objects and things than people and feelings. Now, the cracks really start to show, and they usually always start to show, when he starts talking about women who, and I quote, instead of being more goal-oriented, they are relationship-oriented. They're more concerned with expressing goodness, love, and caring. And women often, as a result, provide suggestions from improvement is the idea. And this is where we take a turn towards the darker motifs in the book. So, again, I quote, when a woman tries to improve a man, he feels she's trying to fix him. He receives the message that he's broken. She doesn't realize her caring attempts to help him may humiliate him. She mistakenly thinks that she is just helping him to grow. And all of a sudden, we're starting to make aware of John Gray's interesting perspectives towards men. This isn't a guy being a guy. This is a guy who's showing some signals of what you'd be tempted to call rejection sensitivity. I quote, he is broken. Her attempts to help him may humiliate him. Either this woman's a banshee or this guy is somewhat delicate. And you might think that I'm overstating the case for comedic effect, but John presents for us the case of Tom and Mary. Tom was driving. After about 20 minutes and going around the same block a few times, it was clear to Mary that Tom was lost. She finally suggested that he call for help. Tom became very silent. They eventually arrived at the party, but the tension from that moment persisted. The whole evening, Mary had no idea of why he was so upset. From her side, she was saying, I love and care about you. I'm offering you this help. But from his side, he was offended. What he heard was, I don't trust you to get us there. You're incompetent. Now, look, Tom, I have some bad news for you, mate. You are incompetent. Mary obviously likes you enough to tolerate your nonsense, but she doesn't want to fuck about in the car with you all night while you pretend to know what you're doing. Mary wants to go to the party, Tom. If somebody's criticizing your behavior, then it might be because your behavior is something worth criticizing. Now, it's definitely true that substantial criticism is one of the classic hallmarks of a failing relationship, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But it's also true that most people can recognize this as constructive or destructive and respond accordingly. And if you can, if you're like Tom, maybe it's you that has the problem. And there are models of behavior that will help you develop this skill, right? You don't need to be like Tom. Again, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. And I recognize that this could be seen as cherry picking. So in case you think I'm being unfair, I just want to show you his idea of, and I quote, some brief examples of ways a man might mistakenly invalidate feelings and perceptions or offer unwanted solutions. See if you can recognize why she would resist. All right, so you can play the game. Let's play the game with John. Let's bend our mind to how helpful solutions such as those John offer might mistakenly invalidate feelings. You ready? It's not such a big deal. Okay, I'm sorry. Now we can just forget about it. All right, I'll clean up the backyard. Does it make you happy? If you're not happy, then we should just go and get a divorce. All right, then. All right, then you can do it from now on. These kinds of things, you might struggle to understand why they would grate on your poor partner's delicate feminine sensibilities. And of course, I would be perfectly happy as a man to receive such fine examples. Let's give some examples on the other side. So here are some, again, I quote, brief examples of ways a woman might unknowingly annoy a man by offering advice or seemingly harmless criticism. Here we go. Those dishes are still wet. They'll dry with spots. Don't put that there. It'll get lost. You should call a plumber. He'll know what to do. You should spend more time with the kids. They miss you. You forgot to bring it home again. Maybe you could put it in a special place where you can remember it. Look, if you are getting criticisms like that, I see absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be getting these criticisms delivered in exactly this manner. This person is gently trying to help you to not be an idiot. Clean the dishes properly and don't lose shit. Don't toy around with the sewage. Play with your kids and bring the stuff you're supposed to home. Don't be like Tom, I can't emphasize how disturbing the place from which this book is written seems to come from. And again, I'm obviously cherry picking, but this isn't unreasonable, I assure you. You can read the book to check. This stuff is littered throughout it. It starts off truthy and then rapidly devolves into this kind of off-the-wall stuff. And let me tell you something, nothing in this chapter has anything to do with men or women. John's men are not reasonable men struggling to understand an overly demanding, more people-oriented group of women. John's men are troubled men reacting absurdly sensitively to their partner's attempts to help them to not be foolish. But by framing it like Mr. Fix-It versus the Home Improvement Committee, he kind of hides that fact. And it's the reason why I was able to just skim through it 10, 15 years ago now. Now, honestly, I've basically made the only point I'm going to, and I have 3 articles on this particular book online, so I don't want to elaborate too much. But the book is darkly hilarious once you notice this pattern. So let me cherry pick a couple more illustrative threads to wrap up. From his introduction, he describes his chapters, and he goes like this. In chapter 3, we'll discover the different ways men and women cope with stress. Men pull away, women feel an instinctive need to talk. I like this one because it starts to show us a theme. So Gray seems to think that women are this kind of overfull cup, spilling their feelings into the lives of their stoic male counterparts. So women talk about stress, they offer unsolicited advice, that's chapter 2, because they value love and communication and relationships. That's a quote. Specifically, again I quote, to share their personal feelings is more important than achieving goals and success. Because remember, in contrast, and I quote again from chapter 2, men value power, competency, efficiency, and achievement. And in his description of chapter 4, he actually points out explicitly how easy this kind of framing can be used to hide masculine incompetence. So, to quote, men are motivated when they feel needed, while women are motivated when they feel cherished. When a man doesn't feel needed in a relationship, he gradually becomes passive and less energized. When a woman does not feel cherished in a relationship, she gradually becomes compulsively responsible and exhausted from giving too much. So you see, all this busy feeling work women are doing is unwelcome because it makes men feel like they're not useful, right? And as a result, they just quit, I suppose. Meanwhile, women, just because they're women, right, no other reason, feel compulsively responsible and exhausted. Probably has nothing to do with all the men pulling away and becoming passive. Now, look, John reckons this is, and he says about chapter 5, men and women speak and even stop speaking for entirely different reasons. Women express feelings. Men express information. And I want to pull out the truthiness here, right? Because there is probably something to this. Gray, if we were being charitable, could be talking about the idea that women, on average are socially trained to be more fluid in the language of interpersonal relationships. There's literature that points in this direction, and I'll put a link in the show notes. So maybe Gray's pointing out that men aren't as good at this and need support to do this. And you might think that because that feels true, but then you look at his examples and you realize it's really not. So, he has this translation guide between men and women. So when women say, we never go out, and men reply, that's not true, we went out last week. Or women say, everyone ignores me. Men reply, I'm sure some people notice you. Or when women say, the house is always a mess, and men reply, it's not always a mess. It seems plausible that men is talking about someone who's interpersonally challenged. Because to Gray, it's obvious to him that in these kinds of interactions, and I quote, you can see how a literal translation of a woman's words could easily mislead a man who is used to using speech as a means of conveying only facts and information. So maybe that's what Gray is talking to, but we should be a little bit suspicious because Gray goes on and it starts to seem a little less literal. So when women say, nothing is working, his men will reply, are you saying it's my fault? Or, I want more romance. He'll respond with, are you saying I'm not romantic? You've got pages and pages of this, and some of them are wild. So again, I quote, without this translation, when a woman says everyone ignores me, the man may hear, I am so unhappy. I just can't get the attention I need. Everything is hopeless. Even you don't notice me, and you are the person who's supposed to love me. You should be ashamed. You are so unloving. I would never ignore you this way. Gray's men are not missing the point because they're hung up on some literal meaning, right? This guy isn't interpreting anything literally. This guy's linguistic analysis is even more complicated than the hypothetical women Gray's trying to describe, right? So again, we have this initially sensible framing. Men are on average probably less socially fluent, so maybe we're not as good at dealing in the language of feelings. But then it just goes on to describe some really bizarre self-worth issues. Now here's the last one I wanted to do. So in chapter 8, and I quote, "Men primarily need a kind of love that is trusting, accepting, and appreciative. Women primarily need a kind of love that is caring, understanding, and respectful." And he goes on to describe, again, what seems reasonable on the surface, but his advice to women is off the wall. So here's what he's titled, "The Art of Empowering a Man." And I quote, "The secret of empowering a man is never try to change him or improve him. Certainly you may want him to change, just don't act on that desire. Only if he directly and specifically asks for advice is he open to assistance in changing." Gray wants you to never change it. You might want to, but never change the man. That's the advice. And if you weren't convinced, he goes on for something like, 3 pages of these helpful list items that go like, let me pick a few. Remember, don't ask him too many questions when he's upset, or he'll feel like you're trying to change him. Remember, give up trying to improve him in any way. He needs your love, not rejection, to grow. Remember, if you make sacrifices hoping he'll do the same, then he'll feel pressured. Practice doing things for yourself and not depending on him to make you happy. We'll do this last one. Remember, if you give him directions and make decisions for him, he'll feel corrected and controlled. Relax and surrender. Surrender to Tom in his car, who's never going to make it to the party. Look, I got to be the first to admit that I get defensive when people are telling me what to do, but I just have a really hard time accepting that this is a man thing. Just don't think anybody likes to be told to change. And I'm frankly gobsmacked that the advice here is for women to just give it up, right? Especially with Gray's men who so obviously need to change. Now we get this kind of impression from the media that we shouldn't change for other people, that our loved ones, our partners, our romantic interests, they should just accept us as we are, So it feels truthy, but anybody knows with just a little bit of reflection that there is no healthy relationship in which one person must just unconditionally accept the other as they are. We compromise for each other's in relationship. That's a big part of relationships. You know it. Any serious self-help book will talk about it. But for Gray, no, it's not men who have to change. It's women who are just too concerned about feelings and shit. If they were more object-oriented, then they wouldn't have these kinds of desires for men to change. And to really illustrate this point, I'm going to wrap this up with probably my most favorite part of the book. So in chapter 12, he's talking about the difference between could you and would you. And for him, to quote, "To women, there's not much of a difference. In fact, could you may even seem more polite than would you, but to many men it's a big difference. Because this distinction is important. I'm including comments by 17 different men who attended my seminars." Let's have a look at some of these comments. Here's one of them. "When I'm asked, could you clean up the backyard? I really take it literally. I say I could do it. I'm sure it's possible. But I'm not saying I will do it, and I certainly don't feel like I'm making a promise to do it. On the other hand, when I'm asked, would you clean up the backyard? I begin to make a decision, and I'm willing to be supportive. If I say yes, the chances of me remembering to do it are much greater because I have made a promise." That's one. Here's another one. "When I'm asked, would you help me, please? It gives me an opportunity to help, and I'm more than willing to support her. But when I hear, could you help me, please, I feel backed up against the wall, as if I have no choice. If I have the ability to help, then I'm expected to help. I don't feel appreciated." Here's the last one that I'm going to pull out of this. When I hear a could you, I'll immediately say yes. And then over the next 10 minutes, I will realize why I'm not going to do it and then ignore the question. But when I hear a will you, a part of me comes up saying, yes, I want to be of service. And then even if objections come up later in my mind, I will still fulfill her request because I have given my word. John has gotten 17 of his mates to help him make a case for how even the most reasonable request that she makes will be agreed to and then consciously ignored over the next 10 minutes simply because she used can you instead of will you, like that annoying high school teacher who would always reply to you, can I go to the bathroom with a, I don't know, can you? And to add insult to injury, this is the chapter that's probably the most detailed of the book, describing how a woman should go about getting what she needs out of the relationship without stepping on any of the intricate interpersonal landmines John and the boys have laid out there. All right. I think that's enough from the book. I think I've made my point. I'll leave you with a little bit of a wrap up, some high level on this framing, and then I'll let you go. I hope I've illustrated it well enough. The framing is the thing here. It starts off and it sounds good. It sounds truthy, right? It's picking up on real threads that exist in our social environment. The main one, women do spend a lot more time interacting with feelings on average, and men are often less fluent at expressing them and validating them. And for the same reason, men are resistant to interpersonal feedback, maybe more so than women, because, again, on average, women probably do this thing more frequently, so they have the social infrastructure to handle it, right? We train women through their socialization to do this stuff, regardless of what you think of their biology. It could be, it could just be purely explained by social phenomena. So some of this stuff does ring true, because if we're not thinking very hard, it's easy to recognize this in the pages and move on. And then it quickly degenerates into something crazy. It's just not good relationship advice. The framing is hiding really problematic behavior. Vogue asked if having a boyfriend is embarrassing, and Tom is embarrassing. John Gray's men are embarrassing. And more generally, what Gray is pushing here is a narrative that leans, less into the ways that women and men are, but more into the way a lazy man might want his woman to be. A book that sort of takes all the social expectations we have about men and women and lays out a case for the worst men to improve a bit, with the implication that women should expect far less from the rest of men. And I don't think that this is Gray's intent. It could be an editor thing. There seems like there's something biographical in there. There's some oddly specific examples that, it makes me wonder how much of this is sort of Gray's travails with his long-suffering wife. So I don't think that it's malicious. But what I think you should do is ignore whatever intent Gray has and view it as a piece of propaganda. Because if you view it as a piece of propaganda, you'd recognize more easily that John isn't describing normal men and normal women. If you imagine that this was written by a lazy, emotionally incompetent man to justify his atrocious behavior to a watching world, you would see that this isn't a reflection of a relationship that anyone would want to be in. So to close, my advice is to people who might be into gender essentialism, if you find yourself connecting with this material, I think you need to ask some delicate questions of yourself. What is it in you that reminds you of the emotionally troubled men that Gray's describing? I connect a great deal, for example, to the defensiveness that he describes. What is it about your partner that makes you think that their reasonable requests are unreasonable? And I think the answers to those questions are really the only valuable advice that this book could hold, because it really is a very shit book. That is my review of Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. You asked for it, 3 articles on it, and a podcast. Please stop asking me about this book. Thanks, guys. I'm going to run, and I'll let you go too.